In this mini lecture, we'll be discussing resistance to extinction. And resistance to extinction is the extent to which responding persists after an extinction procedure has been implemented. So once you remove a reinforcer for behavior, how long does that behavior persist? If a behavior persists for quite a while after the reinforcer is removed, we say that behavior has a high level of resistance to extinction. If the behavior weakens or decreases very quickly after the reinforcer is removed, we say that behavior has a low level of resistance to extinction. And there are several different things that can influence a behavior's level of resistance to extinction. The first is the schedule of reinforcement, and this is the most important factor influencing resistance to extinction. And as we talked about last week when we discussed schedules of reinforcement, behavior that is maintained on an intermittent or partial schedule of reinforcement will extinguish more slowly than a behavior that has been maintained on a continuous schedule. So if a behavior is on a continuous schedule of reinforcement, meaning that every time the behavior is shown, it is followed by a reinforcer. Once you remove that reinforcer, that behavior will decrease very quickly. It will have a low level of resistance to extinction once that reinforcer is removed. By contrast, if a behavior is on an intermittent or partial schedule of reinforcement, meaning that not every single instance of that behavior is reinforced, once you remove the reinforcer, behavior will persist for a lot longer. The organism will continue to show the behavior longer than if it had been used to having every single instance of that behavior reinforced. The schedule of reinforcement can influence how resistant a behavior is to extinction. The history of reinforcement also influences the level of resistance to extinction. So the more reinforcers an individual has received for behavior, the greater the resistance to extinction. So if a person has a long history of reinforcement, they've shown this behavior many times and they're used to getting reinforced for it, once that reinforcer is removed, the behavior will persist. It will be highly resistant to extinction. The idea is you want to nip certain behaviors in the bud. You don't want people to get used to being reinforced for this behavior, because then if the reinforcer is removed, it will still persist in the behavior because they have so much experience getting reinforced for this behavior. If you remove the reinforcers quickly, remove them early on in the development of the behavior, it will be a lot less resistant to extinction. You can remove the reinforcer and the behavior will quickly decrease, as opposed to if you had a long history of being reinforced for that behavior. Another factor that can influence the resistance to extinction is the magnitude of the reinforcer. So typically, large magnitude reinforcers result in greater resistance to extinction as opposed to small magnitude reinforcers. This is not always the case. So let's say you engage in a behavior and the reinforcer for that behavior is a sum of money. If that reinforcer is removed, the behavior is likely to persist because it at one time led to such a large reinforcer. If the behavior led to a small sum of money and that sum of money is removed, behavior is a lot less resistant to extinction. It will decrease more quickly because you don't have the experience of that behavior leading to a large magnitude reinforcer. In some cases, a larger reinforcer will lead to slower extinction. It will lead to a greater resistance to extinction in that behavior. Next, degree of deprivation. This is the degree to which an organism is deprived of a reinforcer, and that can affect the resistance to extinction. Let's go back to our example of the soda machine. So if you use a soda machine, you put in money, you push a button, the soda comes out. You may repeat that behavior one more time, put in more money, but typically, very quickly, that behavior will extinguish because you're not getting the reinforcer. Now imagine the same scenario. What if you're really thirsty? You've been deprived of liquids. You're in a deprivation. Then that behavior is a lot more resistant to extinction. It'll persist a lot longer. So if you're dying of thirst, you're much more likely to continue that behavior, putting money into the soda machine and pushing the button, trying to get that reinforcer of something to drink, just because you're in such great need of it. So the more deprived you are of reinforcer, the longer the behavior will persist after extinction begins. So another factor to consider is previous experience with extinction. So when sessions of extinction are alternated with sessions of reinforcement, the greater the number of prior exposures to extinction, the quicker the behavior will extinguish during subsequent extinction sessions. This means when you have experience alternating between periods of reinforcement and extinction, the greater experience you have with extinction, the more quickly you learn to recognize an extinction session, and the more quickly your behavior decreases. So let's say, for example, you have a friend who very often answers your phone calls. So you call her once, she quickly answers the phone. But sometimes she gets in these moods where she doesn't respond to your phone calls, and how much you call, she will not answer you. Once you've alternated between these two phases of her sometimes answering your call, and your behavior of calling her is being reinforced, and these periods of where you call and she doesn't answer, and your behavior of calling is not being reinforced, it's being extinguished, the more you've gone through those trials, the more quickly you recognize an extinction session, meaning she's not answering my calls. I know that no matter how much I call for this time period, she is not going to reinforce me by answering the phone. And so then you quickly stop making those calls. So it's as if you've learned to recognize when your behavior is being extinguished, and so you stop it very quickly. Let's say in the beginning, when you hadn't been through those trials, she stops answering the phone calls. You might call her over and over and over because you don't recognize that when she gets in these moods, she's just not going to answer the phone. So the behavior persists. But once you become accustomed to these time periods, you might call her a couple of times or call her one time and say, she's not answering, so I'll just stop this behavior. So the more experience you have with these extinction sessions, the more quickly you recognize them, and the more quickly your behavior extinguishes, the less resistant to extinction those behaviors are. If you want to speed up the extinction of a behavior, you can use a distinctive signal for extinction. So extinction is facilitated when there is a distinctive stimulus that signals the onset of extinction. So it signals that reinforcement is not available. So if you see an out of order sign on a soda machine, this will extinguish the behavior putting money into the machine very quickly because it gives you a distinctive signal that says you will not be reinforced if you put your money in. Reinforcement is not available. So the out of order sign comes to serve as a discriminative stimulus for extinction. That lets you know that if you perform the behavior, you will not be getting the reinforcement. As a result, it speeds extinction. You see this discriminative stimulus for extinction, you're much less likely to show the behavior because you know that it will not be forced. This is a good example for being able to read people's facial expressions. So people who have high emotional intelligence, they can read facial expressions. They can see when a person has this look on their face, they're open to being approached, they're open to being talked to. If I speak to them, I'm likely to get the reinforcement of a good conversation. When a person is busy, they have a different expression on their face, they're preoccupied. If I were to approach that person and talk to them, they're unlikely to be receptive, so I'm not going to get that reinforcement. So a person's facial expression can serve as a discriminative stimulus, either to let you know that you will get reinforced if you talk to them, or you will not get reinforced if you speak to them. So at the beginning of the semester, when we talked about classical conditioning, we talked about the idea of spontaneous recovery. And this is also a term that can be applied to operant conditioning. So with regard to operant behaviors, spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of an extinguished response following a period of rest after extinction. So if you have a behavior that has been extinguished, so maybe you give your child attention when they tantrum, the tantrums have increased, you decide you want to extinguish that behavior, you start ignoring them, you withdraw your attention when they tantrum. Over time, the tantrums have become extinguished. The child is no longer tantruming. After a while, that behavior can spontaneously reoccur. So the child may again start to show tantruming behavior. It's almost as if they're trying to see if they can get that reinforcer again for tantruming. So it's been extinguished, they haven't shown the behavior in a while, and that behavior can just spontaneously pop up again they're showing the behavior that had been extinguished. The important thing to remember is not to give in and give the reinforcer, because if then you give the reinforcer of attention, that behavior will again begin to strengthen and begin to be shown more frequently. With spontaneous recovery, if the person doesn't get the reinforcer, behavior very quickly dies off again. It goes back into extinction. But if you do give a reinforcer for the behavior will become more prevalent. You just have to kind of wait out that period of spontaneous recovery. Something you can do to facilitate the process of extinction is to use differential reinforcement of other behavior, abbreviated as DRO. And so one way to facilitate extinction is by reinforcing another behavior while you try to extinguish the target behavior. So if you have a child who has been acting up in class and they get attention for acting up in class, you decide you want to extinguish that behavior by removing the attention, you then want to make sure that you reinforce other behaviors. You reinforce the appropriate behaviors. So while you're withdrawing the attention for the acting up in class, you then want to give them attention for appropriate behaviors. So you might give attention for being kind to classmates or give attention for completing assignments in a timely fashion. You want to make sure the person understands that they have a path to get that reinforcer that's being withdrawn for a particular behavior. If you don't reinforce another behavior, then you put that person into a state of deprivation. As we talked about a few slides ago, when you're in a state of deprivation, your behaviors are more likely to persist and extinction begins. So if you have a child who's used to getting attention for acting up and you remove the attention for acting up, but don't give attention for other behaviors, they're so starved for the attention, they're going to persist in that behavior of acting up because they know in the past they've gotten the attention for that behavior. Even though the attention has been removed, they're not getting the attention now, you're going to persist and continue that behavior in hopes of getting the reinforcement. As opposed to if you give them attention for something else, they can get that reinforcement through another behavior. So again, going back to our soda machine example, if you're thirsty, there's one soda machine, you put your money in and the soda is broken, you may persist in putting money in and pushing different buttons because that's the only option. That's the only way to get the reinforcer of something to drink. Now compare that to what if there is a water fountain or another machine right next to it where you can get a drink. If there's an alternative to get that reinforcement, you'll choose the alternative. You don't have to persist putting money into the broken machine because there's another way to get the reinforcement. If there's another way to get the reinforcement you seek, the original behavior is going to be a lot less resistant to extinction. It's going to quickly extinguish because you have another route for reinforcement. But if there's only one way to get that reinforcement, you're going to persist with that behavior even though the reinforcer for that behavior has been removed.